A nation changed and challenged. From New York's Ground Zero to the Pentagon, to a field in Pennsylvania, across America, and around the world. A day to remember September 11th then and now. Where does the nation go from here?
America remembers. This is a special edition of NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. In New York, Pennsylvania, and at the Pentagon, this was a day that was at once emotionally exhausting, but also uplifting. A day in which the nation was drawn to the sites of the terrorist attacks 1 year ago by a common need to remember, grieve, and reflect on where we go from here. This evening, President and Mrs. Bush were at Ground Zero, New York, walking down the ramp into what many consider to be sacred ground, the vast pit where the World Trade Centers once stood, talking to family members one by one. To everyone's relief, there have been no international terrorist incidents, but the elevated state of readiness remains in place, Code Orange, activated when administration intelligence officials learned that there could be other attacks on the anniversary, primarily against U.S. interests overseas. Now, here's NBC's Roger O'Neill from Ground Zero on the first anniversary of 9/11 and how it moved a nation. Roger?
Tom, good evening. Today, they came to memorialize, to honor, and for the first time for the relatives, a chance to touch Ground Zero. All left a rose. Some took home a handful of sacred ground. The bagpipers' haunting sound, Amazing Grace. From New York's 5 boroughs, converging on Ground Zero. It was a peaceful September morning today, but at 8:46, the same minute the first jet hit the World Trade Center a year ago, just as the first moment of silence began, suddenly the wind started blowing, and there was turbulence again at Ground Zero. As they did a year ago, relatives clutched pictures of loved ones. Today, not in search of, but in honor of. United in time's history, Americans at 3 memorials stood silent today when time a year ago stood still. 8:46 a.m., 9:03 a.m., New York, 2,801 dead. 9:38 a.m., Washington, 184 dead. 10:06 a.m., Shanksville, Pennsylvania, 40 dead.
Vincent, a body.
In New York for 2 hours and 29 minutes from the first A,
Joseph Angelini, Sr.
David Lawrence Angel.
to the last Z,
Igor Zuckelman.
the names of those lost here echoed through the gaping crater of the World Trade Center. As loved ones walked down the ramp to where the Twin Towers stood, what stood out was their diversity, a mirror of America's diversity, today, together.
They were our neighbors, our husbands, our children, our sisters, our brothers, and our wives. They were our countrymen and our friends. They were us.
At the Pentagon and in Pennsylvania, I pledge allegiance
of the United States of America, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty
and justice for all, which President Bush promised today as he visited all 3 sites.
The murder of innocents cannot be explained, only endured. And though they died in tragedy, they did not die in vain.
Jane C. Folger.
Often overshadowed by New York and Washington, today as 40 doves were released over the Pennsylvania countryside honoring the passengers of Flight 93, it was Muriel Borza, 11, whose sister died here, whose simple eloquence made all pause.
I have a wish that can fulfill in memory of those who perished on September 11th. I ask for 1 minute of peace worldwide today, September 11th, 2002.
Peace is what many relatives were looking for today at Ground Zero. What began as an empty circle of honor became a ring of roses, a centerpiece of remembrance, and a place to save forever what was forever lost 1 year ago. Often forgotten as America tries to remember the thousands of people who were in these buildings who got out alive. For them, for all of the relatives, today was an awful anniversary. But they got through today, and tomorrow will be tomorrow. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's Roger O'Neill tonight. Today's ceremonies were not confined just to the attack sites. This was not just about New York or Washington or rural Pennsylvania. NBC's Bob Faw tonight in Utah on the national need to be a part of this day. Robert?
Tom, Main Street America was changed by 9/11, and even though in small towns like this one, Salina, they have moved on, nonetheless, across the country, Main Street did pause to remember. It was a day of special sounds, special sights, from church bells in all corners of America to prayers uttered in mosques in Los Angeles. In Houston, they laid down special white carnations for the victims of 9/11. In Chicago, for firefighters and policemen, they planted trees. And almost everywhere there was music, mournful and stirring. This, one of 30 choirs around the world, performing Mozart's glorious Requiem. Some ceremonies were elaborate. In Cincinnati, students gathered to form a human map. At the Florida Elementary School, where President Bush first learned about the attacks, students sang what many feel. We're proud to be an American. And it wasn't just America. In Tokyo, a moment of silence observed at the Nikkei Stock Exchange. In Italy, gondoliers honored America's loss. And spiraling over Paris, beams of light reflecting the fallen towers. From Overland Park, Kansas, where a temple lit one candle for each victim, to Freeport, Maine, where virtually the entire town turned out to parade, everywhere it seemed was a time to reflect, and as at this flag-raising ceremony here in Salina, Utah, time to reaffirm. And yet for many on Main Street, especially in this bone-dry region, other issues like the drought matter more now than 9/11.
Last year I thought a little bit about what happened on 9/11, but as far as the way of my life, we hear about it out here, but it really doesn't affect us much. At Mom's Cafe, where everything is made from scratch, the mayor says the big concern here is not Al-Qaeda.
I don't think the terrorism is particularly frightening to the public. I think it's more the drugs thing is more frightening.
Partly, it's a matter of geography. Salina is a long, long way from the Pentagon or the World Trade Center. Partly, it's a mindset. Out here, people don't feel as vulnerable because there's a different ethic.
I guess maybe the code of the Old West is we'll kind of take care of ourselves.
And truth be told, in places like Salina, where daily routines have not changed, many still feel that 9/11 is something which happened out there, to others, not to us.
Of course there's terrorism, but that's for the big boys to handle. I don't know. I can't focus on everything.
That's too far away.
It's too big to comprehend in a little area like this.
What has changed here, though, are perceptions, a new awareness of what can happen. And on Main Street here, there is a renewal of patriotism.
I think that we'll take care of it. America's a strong country, and we'll do it.
All the more reason why on Main Street, where there is still a feeling of security in the familiar, there is also a belief that what happened 1 year ago cannot be allowed to change what happens in Salina.
I think we have to be optimistic. I have a fear for my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, but we can't stop living. None of us can. We have to go on.
And that is the prevailing view on Main Street, sobered by 9/11, but quietly defiant, determined that life here must go on much as it has. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's Bob Fall tonight. All this going on today, well, the country remains on high alert. That's condition orange. It's the second highest level of terror alert. And as you might expect, nerves have been on edge all day with a series of false alarms involving airlines, police, and the FBI. Joining me now from Washington, NBC's Justice Department correspondent, Pete Williams. Pete?
A day of jitters, Tom. Federal agents tonight are watching a cargo ship bound for the port of New York and New Jersey. The ship carrying some cargo from the Middle East was ordered back out to sea by the Coast Guard after sensors picked up unusual levels of radiation. A federal team is on its way with more sensitive equipment. As for law enforcement over the past year, the Justice Department insists its actions have been constitutional and have not violated individual rights. But federal judges are starting to say some steps go too far.
Tarek al-Basti, born in Egypt and now a U.S. citizen in Indiana, was arrested in mid-October when authorities discovered he took pilot lessons. He was held for 10 days, and his lawyer couldn't find out why.
I've never been told that I cannot discuss certain facts with my client, particularly when it is based on those facts he is being held in jail.
Many legal experts say such cases show that in balancing civil liberties and increased security, the average American has not given much up.
What we have done for the most part is avoided that difficult choice and instead targeted immigrants and said we're willing to give up their rights, their liberties, for our security.
Most of the 750 immigrants picked up in the search for terrorists have now been released. Civil libertarians claim that shows the government rounded up the wrong people.
Allah Akbar.
And Arab American groups say the government's decision to handle the immigration cases in secret makes immigrants less likely to report suspicious behavior.
They're fearful of how that information will be used or how they might be targeted.
Privacy advocates also question new rules that allow FBI agents to attend mosques and investigate whether suspects are checking out potential terror instruction books from public libraries. Civil libertarians say they're even more concerned about the government's decision to hold 2 Americans as enemy combatants without first having to prove the cases in any kind of court.
On that theory, anyone can be locked up. On that theory, I could be locked up, you could be locked up. It requires no showing of any actual culpability or even suspicion.
But in defending the government's actions, federal agents say September 11th put American law enforcement on a war footing, making it urgent to round up people who might have terror connections, while investigators sorted out who had actual ties to al-Qaeda. And the Attorney General insists that all those detained in the civilian system violated some rule or law. He says the aggressive detentions are necessary to stop a determined enemy that's willing to use suicide attacks.
Once you get into this context of people who are willing to die, prosecution isn't the answer. Prevention has to be the answer.
As for secret hearings, the government says small details that seem innocuous in any given case could add up to a mosaic of valuable information, giving a roadmap of the government's counter-terror tactics.
So far, the government has a mixed record in court on its terrorism strategy, with some of these cases almost certainly bound for the Supreme Court in its term that starts this fall. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's Pete Williams tonight. That brings us to America's growing Arab and Muslim communities. For many, this has been the year, as one observer put it, that the American dream for them descended into nightmares. NBC's national correspondent is Jim Avila.
Weeks after the September 11th terrorist attack, Arab-American social service worker Aitad El-Shalabi heard a knock on her suburban Chicago door. It was the FBI.
Someone had phoned in a tip anonymously about that I'm raising a terrorist for Hamas.
The FBI was looking for a terrorist. Aitad is a widow and her son's in grammar school. When the boy they wanted to question was summoned, the agent's eyes widened. He was 8 years old.
Shock and amazed, and I said, "You didn't know?" They're like, "No, we thought he was older."
This is Janine Athman, an American of Palestinian descent, born 42 years ago in suburban Chicago. Now worried, everything she learned as an American about justice and civil rights collapsed along with New York's Twin Towers.
All of a sudden, this, the regular Constitution doesn't apply to Muslims somehow.
By evening September 11, many of this country's 1,200 mosques were suddenly targets of retaliation. Here, where Jeannine's family worships, riot police were called in to protect Muslims. Jeannine heard President Bush tell America the attackers were not true followers of Islam. And right away, she knew that peaceful American Muslims needed to reinforce that message by connecting to the mainstream. Leave the cocoon, as she calls it, practicing Islam in isolation, her children in Islamic school, and tell her non-Muslim neighbors of the innocence of her religion.
I felt like really that Islam was taken hostage with and hijacked along with those planes.
Thank you for bringing us together again.
Jeannine found a receptive audience in a completely different culture, the Catholic Church in an adjacent suburb. 5 Muslim women meeting monthly with 5 Catholic women.
The first thing that they had said to us at dialogue was that the terrorists were not people that were following their Islamic faith.
Elaine Rand says she had no Muslim friends before 9/11. Now she has 5 and new wisdom.
Get to know a person always before judging them as a group, to know what the Islam religion is about, and to accept Muslim people.
Lessons millions of innocent Muslims pray their fellow Americans learn before that next knock on the door. Jim Avila, NBC News, Chicago.
Now to the war front. Where are we a year later in the war on terror, and where is it going? We go to NBC's Jim Miklashevsky at the Pentagon, just a short distance away from where that plane did so much damage a year ago today. Jim?
And Tom, those terrorist attacks right here at the Pentagon and the World Trade Center not only changed America, but may have forever changed the way the U.S. military plans and fights a war. The war in Afghanistan has been about as unconventional as it gets. American troops armed with high technology charging into battle on horseback. It's the opening shot in America's war on terrorism, where every fight will be different from the last.
The next battlefield, wherever it happens to be, is not going to look like Afghanistan.
But where is the next battlefield? Sources tell NBC News the next likely target, Al-Qaeda terrorists in Yemen. The USS Cole was attacked there 2 years ago, and it remains a hotbed for Al-Qaeda today. It's where Osama bin Laden has had a network of safe houses used as central switchboards to pass along orders for a number of terrorist operations, including 9/11. NBC News has learned a small number of American special forces may already be in country. 800 more troops standing by in the region to help the Yemeni government go after Al-Qaeda cells and terrorist camps. Other potential targets span the globe, from Somalia, a lawless haven for terrorists, to South America, where there's a growing threat from Islamic extremists in remote areas bordered by Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. Wherever the fight, American Special Forces will lead the way. It was Special Forces bodyguards who killed the would-be assassins of Afghan President Hamid Karzai last week.
We have the skills to do whatever needs to be done, wherever it needs to be done.
Even Iraq. NBC News has learned that American Special Forces have already been inside Iraq, scoping out potential airstrips for use in a possible U.S. invasion. American warplanes would pound Iraqi forces with high-precision bombs, but the decisive battles would likely be fought in the streets of Baghdad.
It's unlikely that Saddam Hussein is going to want to fight out in the desert again. He has seen what happened in Desert Storm.
That means Special Forces fighting street to street, door to door. An extremely high-risk operation where the enemy has the advantage.
You're really talking about an urban jungle. And just like guerrilla warfare in any other jungle, it allows the enemy to get in very, very close.
But before that, there's still unfinished business in Afghanistan, where American troops continue the search for Osama bin Laden. Jim Miklashevsky, NBC News, the Pentagon.
As you might expect, this country's airports were very quiet today. And joining me now with more on how the air travel system is faring, NBC's Robert Hager at Reagan National Airport in Washington. Robert?
Quiet is right, Tom. You can see from the empty ticket counter back there, 3,000 flights canceled in advance, and the rest going out less than half full all across the nation. Compared to a normal Wednesday, it means almost 1 million people chose not to fly today. And with the system on edge, there were incidents. A Northwest Airlines flight from Memphis to Las Vegas diverted to Fort Smith, Arkansas, where 4 men were taken off for questioning. Turned out one had been shaving with a razor in the lavatory. An American flight from Houston to Dallas returned after takeoff because someone thought a passenger had a knife. It was really a comb. And a Russian cargo plane chartering U.S. troops and missile equipment from Europe to Fort Bliss, Texas, was ordered to land early because of an incorrect flight plan. And just look at the nearly deserted terminals today, from Los Angeles International to Chicago's O'Hare to Newark, New Jersey. Travelers wary of trouble today, but so far, nothing serious. It's been safe. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's Robert Hager tonight at Reagan National Airport in Washington. I'll be back with more of our special coverage, America Remembers. But first, a look at how the world remembered this day.
Beamer, Alan Bevan, Mark Bingham, Deora Bodley, Marion Britton, Thomas E. Burnett, Jr.
There are some rays of light in a day that otherwise was so somber and sad. Tonight, we revisit a woman whose story touched so many of you a year ago, a woman who lost her husband at Ground Zero, but after weeks of anguish, a moment of pure joy. NBC's Ann Thompson now with a family remembering and rebuilding.
To go forward, first Jackie Gavigan had to go back to Montauk.
Take your shoes off.
To their special place on Long Island. To the house her husband Donald, a bond trader at Cantor Fitzgerald, bought after the birth of their twins.
Hello, Jacqueline.
To where they spent their last week before September 11th.
I was always a strong person, and I know that's why my husband married me. So maybe I'm a little stronger now.
She never imagined then how strong she would have to be.
Here you go, Chubby.
Look up.
To give birth to their third child, 6 weeks after Donald's death, with just his picture to show son Connor.
Daddy. Daddy. And I'm going to tell you all about Daddy. What a great guy he was.
To walk back into a hospital 6 months later, now head of the Donald Gavigan Jr. Fund. To see its first beneficiary, a 6-year-old boy from Kosovo, undergo the same kind of surgery that saved their eldest son's life.
Yeah, remember, look, he's got a boo-boo like you did.
To host a summer block party in their Brooklyn neighborhood, raising another $42,000 for Donald's fund. So September is no longer the cruelest month.
As each September approaches, I don't want to only have a vision of two falling towers. Instead, I want my children and I to focus on the child we will save in memory of their wonderful daddy, Donald Richard Gavigan Jr.
I used to hate microphones. I used to never be able to speak on those things. So what changed you? I have no idea. Maybe my husband's coming through with me. I don't know.
Run! Now both mom and dad to Lara, Donald III, and Connor, her most important job is raising their children.
I think it helps having children to stay focused and rebuild the life. Because my children deserve to be happy.
And there's one child in particular.
My blue-eyed baby.
When he was born, all you wished for
was that he would look like his dad.
Oh, yeah.
Does he?
Oh, definitely. Especially his eyes.
The twins, now 3, still talk about their dad. Donald likes to sit in his Jeep. Lara still looks for its tracks in the sand.
No, honey. Last year, Daddy's Jeep came over here. My biggest fear is it will affect them some point in the future, and that's something I'm hoping to avoid.
Do you worry they'll be angry?
Yes, very worried.
And bitter?
Yes, and that's why I don't want to be a bitter mother or an angry mother. I want to show them how you could turn something tragic into something positive, so I want to be a good role model for them.
In just 1 year's time, Jackie's done that.
And then you can erase it.
And yet the smile from this little boy with a repaired heart
Magic.
cannot replace the sight she still longs for on Montauk.
I could just see my husband coming up with his car and my children running to him. And it was so nice to see, and I miss that.
And when she needs to be close to him, she goes to the lighthouse
So this is a
and
favorite
his
spot?
bench to remember.
It was very hard seeing my husband's name the first time. He was never one for a gravesite, so I think he would be happy about this, because this is really all I have is a bench.
And memories. And children. Strong enough at last to welcome the promise of the future. Ann Thompson, NBC News, Montauk, Long Island.
America remembers. While some stations will be leaving us now, for most of you, there is more of this special edition of NBC Nightly News right after this. First, Manhattan, then Ground Zero, that is Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where the United flight crashed, obviously. Ceremonies there today. We're back now from here in New York, where the president has come to pay his respects at Ground Zero, speak to the nation, and spend the night before his speech at the United Nations tomorrow about another possible war against Iraq. That is what is going on at this hour. We want to go now to NBC's David Bloom, who has the story of 3 heroes.
Tom, when the wind picked up here at almost precisely 8:46 this morning, the dust from Ground Zero began swirling about, sweeping across the pits, climbing into the sky. It was, said many victims' families, an almost spiritual, life-affirming moment. In much the same way, many of the people we first met 1 year ago lifted us up, affirming on that horrible day what was best about America. When the president rekindled America's spirits, he stood side by side with Bob Beckwith. When a hero on a doomed flight said, "Let's roll," he took comfort and prayed with Lisa Jefferson. When American Flight 77 hit the Pentagon, one man helped save countless lives, David Tarantino. 1 year later, these are their stories. Retired New York City firefighter Bob Beckwith still visits Ground Zero, but his face is more weathered, and there's a pain in his eyes from a year's worth of funerals.
You see these widows, young widows, small children, and your heart just breaks.
But he vividly recalls that day when spirits soared at Ground Zero, when the president wrapped his arm around Beckwith and New York, and the rescuers strained to listen.
And they said, "We can't hear you." And then he turned it and he said,
"I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon."
It was like he just lifted us right up. Let's get back to work. I said, wow. I said, what a home run.
In the city?
Lisa Jefferson is more ambivalent about her brush with fame.
You didn't ask for all this attention, all this media hoopla.
No, I didn't. I can see
Jefferson, a Verizon Airphone supervisor, still wipes tears from her eyes as she recalls her 45-minute conversation with Todd Beamer, before he and other passengers stormed the cockpit and forced the crash of United Flight 93 south of Pittsburgh.
When I have a moment, I constantly think about that phone call. It replays in my mind. And the worst part of the phone call was just hearing those people scream for their lives.
Whose team do you want to be on?
This spring, she met Lisa Beamer's baby girl, Morgan, whose dark hair and dimple remind everyone of her dad.
It was pretty hard, you know, seeing that I was able to see his daughter and he was not. And she looks just like him.
Jefferson says she's still haunted by that phone call, but she's come to believe it was meant for her.
I was the messenger that day for the Beamer family. God works in mysterious ways. My name is Lisa. Ty's wife's name is Lisa. And when we called 911 to reach the FBI to report this, the dispatcher's name was Lisa. So when I sit back and think about all this connection, I don't think it was coincidental. I believe I was the person that was chosen to take that phone call.
At the Pentagon, sheer courage put rescuer David Tarantino in Jerry Henson's path. They first reunited after Henson was released from the hospital last September.
I've been looking forward to this.
With the Pentagon in flames, Lieutenant Commander Tarantino, a Navy doctor hailed as a hero, led dozens of people to safety. But the thick, black smoke was choking him.
I came down here to get some fresh air. These windows were broken out and spewing flames. That whole wall was gone. It was a big, jagged hole, and there was a huge aircraft landing gear tire sitting right there.
Now, for the first time, Tarantino returns to the rebuilt area, where he pulled Henson, who was pinned underneath his desk from the burning rubble.
And where he was, incredible smoke. I could barely breathe. It was amazing that he had the fight and the drive to stay alive for as long as he did.
1 minute later, the walls collapsed. Now the two men say they honor those who died here by coming to work today and every day. Their paths cross, no longer strangers.
I wouldn't be here had it not been for him. He's my new best friend.
They are but three of the faces from those first few days, struggling like many of us, not to forget, but to move on, and by their example, leading the way. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's David Bloom at Ground Zero tonight. As David pointed out, President Bush's moment at Ground Zero with David Beckwith of the New York Fire Department undoubtedly will be one of his most memorable. NBC's White House correspondent David Gregory has a look now at how this day, 1 year ago, changed everything for the administration and the man.
If there is one moment that captures how much 9/11 changed this president and his presidency, most agree it is this. Mr. Bush at Ground Zero.
And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Presidential counselor and friend Karen Hughes.
I thought that moment was the most real moment I'd seen of him since he'd been president.
Somehow there was a transfusion of energy at that moment that he became a part of all of us and then was able to give us back, in his words, what we were thinking and feeling.
There's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said, "Wanted, dead or alive."
Bush's blunt style seemed the perfect fit for an angry and anguished nation. And politically, the president was transformed. After setbacks earlier in the year, the Democrats gaining control of Congress, deficits returning, and the president's approval rating sagging, by November of last year, an astonishing 88% of the country approved of its leader. The transformation of the Bush presidency was, however, more profound than politics. 9/11 changed the way this president saw the world and his mission in office.
We haven't seen anything yet.
As a candidate, Mr. Bush railed against big government and bureaucracy. After 9/11, he proposed the largest expansion of the government in 50 years, proposing the creation of a Homeland Security Department. Candidate Bush advocated strict limits on the role of U.S. troops.
I don't think our troops ought to be used for what's called nation building.
Now the administration is doing just that in Afghanistan and would be forced to do the same in Iraq. Perhaps most significant of all, the president has abandoned the Cold War doctrines of deterrence and containment.
If we wait for threats to fully materialize, we will have waited too long.
adopting a strategy of preemptive strikes that some fear could inspire other, less stable nations to copy us.
It could be dangerous policy if the rest of the world sees us as resorting to the doctrine of preemption as a first step rather than a last step.
1 year later, a president transformed by 9/11 is once again facing steep challenges, none bigger than leading a war on terror that inspires less unity now than before.
He has to educate and shape public opinion. The first time, all he had to do was reflect it. It was right there for him. He had perfect pitch, and he did it. But now this is a much harder task.
A test of leadership perhaps even greater than what the president faced in last September's ashes. David Gregory, NBC News, the White House.
Recently, I sat down with Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld at the Pentagon to talk about conflicts, those going on now, those on the horizon. I asked the Secretary if 1 year after the September 11th attacks, he could quantify just how much damage had been done to the Al-Qaeda organization.
I would say it's very difficult to know. What we do know is that we have killed in the low hundreds, that we've captured in the medium to low hundreds, that the bulk of those that were in Afghanistan have dispersed. So they're still out there. They're in sleeper cells. They're having much more difficulty recruiting. They're having more difficulty raising money, transferring money, moving from country to country. All is much more difficult. But they're still there, a lot of them, and we have to keep after them.
Are they moving their operations off the subcontinent into places in Southeast Asia?
Oh, I don't doubt it for a minute, but that some of them have ended up there. They also have ended up in, they're clearly in Iran. There are some in Iraq. There's some in Yemen. Some may have come to the United States.
Many people in the region and longtime students of the region believe that the United States is losing the battle for the hearts and minds of a new generation of young Muslims, in part because of our alliance with Israel during this protracted battle that it's having with the Palestinians.
There's no question but that Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein and the Iranians and others terrorist states are attempting to use the Palestinian problem and the issues between Israel and the Palestinians as a way of creating anti-Western feeling, and that's a fact.
But many of the so-called moderate Arab states, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, are saying to the United States, don't move against Iraq and don't try to do other things until you resolve what's going on between Israel and the Palestinians.
I can understand their saying what they're saying. I can understand their concern, and I can understand their desire, and I share their desire to have that problem solved. The problem is the problem's been there since 1947, and it's not likely to get solved in the next 5 minutes.
Looking forward from September 11th, in the next year or so, where will the United States have a conspicuous military presence that we're now not involved?
Today, it is not possible to know exactly from whom or where a threat will come. Therefore, what we have to do, and we've changed our strategy to do this, we have to organize and train and equip to cope with capabilities that can threaten us, regardless of where they come from.
Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld tonight. Now the perspective from the front lines, Afghanistan, where American troops have been fighting the war on terror for almost a year. NBC's Tom Aspel tonight with the elite 82nd Airborne.
The sun had just come up on Monday when the crackle of incoming gunfire ripped through the 82nd Airborne's base camp near Khost. A gun battle between feuding Afghan warlords sparked this firefight. It's Alpha Company's first time in close combat. Their average age, just 24. Their orders, shoot to kill.
There he is, light him up.
The company's mission is to protect special forces hunting remnants of Al-Qaeda and hardline Taliban still fighting in the mountains along the border with Pakistan. Alpha's overwhelming firepower drives the Afghans back. Overhead, an Apache gunship buzzes the tree line, watching the Afghans retreat, but they leave behind 4 dead and 7 wounded. Inside the base clinic, Army medics work to save the injured Afghans.
We need to try to stabilize that cloud.
The battle short and bloody, but no American casualties. Company Commander Captain Whit Wright is still on a combat high at the debrief.
everybody at every level, we did the right thing.
This war is far from over. Paktiar is probably the most dangerous place in Afghanistan for American soldiers right now. They depend on superb training and teamwork to survive. Most of the company has already been here for months and won't be rotated out till after the new year. Until then, they live 24/7 on high alert, always within 2 feet of their weapons. Their duties split between base security and reconnaissance patrols outside the wire. A life hard for folks back home to imagine. Specialist Keith Denzing from Long Island, New York.
Unless you actually did it, they would never understand.
A lot of people think we're crazy, and we are.
They unwind with rock music pumping as they clean their weapons, but they never forget they're in a war.
We're not peacekeepers. We go out and stop. We go out and hurt people.
The target, Al-Qaeda. U.S. intelligence says they are regrouping in these rugged mountains along the Pakistan border. The challenge for Alpha Company and the 82nd Airborne at the sharp end of this war on terror is to destroy them once and for all. Tom Aspel, NBC News, Southeast Afghanistan.
There is another fierce battle to report tonight in the war on terror. In Pakistan, police commandos traded gunfire with al-Qaeda suspects holed up in a Karachi apartment for 3 hours. The fighting spilled out onto the rooftops, and when it was over, 2 suspects had been killed, another 5 captured. Police confiscated a laptop computer and an arsenal of assault weapons, submachine guns, and hand grenades. Although the government of Pakistan has supported much of the U.S. war on terror, a year later, it is clear that Pakistan is also the breeding ground for some of the people who hate America and want to kill us. As NBC's Mike Taibbi reports tonight, it is in the classrooms of Pakistan's Islamic madrasas where more than 1.5 million young men may be learning to hate America.
They begin each day praying in the dark, from the oldest teachers and students to the youngest, like 10-year-old Rahimullah, the sleep still in him, but the call to morning prayer already a constant in his life. At sunrise, Rahimullah and the youngest students have a quiet breakfast before starting an 8-hour day of rote memorization of Islam's sacred text, the Quran, in Arabic. 4 years of this, phase 1 of the standard curriculum at the Mansoura Madrasa in Lahore, one of the 10,000 private Islamic schools in Pakistan. For the older students, some exercise before plunging into their own long days of interpreting the Quran. A few also study English.
Sun rises in the east. Sun rises in the east.
Before returning, always, to religion. We saw no military training and no classes in weapons, as in some madrasas, but the worry outside the compound is that intolerance and hatred are being passed on in conservative madrasas like this one. Schools whose students fueled violent anti-Western protests last fall and the Taliban movement before that, and who see themselves as fighters in a holy war, a jihad. We still support the Taliban, said Jovid when we sat with his class, and believe Osama bin Laden is an innocent hero.
How many people think that the attacks in America last September 11th were pulled off by Muslims? Nobody believes that.
What they do believe is the old wildfire rumor that there were no Jews in the towers that day, proving that the attacks were a Jewish conspiracy with help from the United States.
How many think America is a friend?
America is our enemy.
Which makes some of these madrasas breeding grounds for terror, says Dr. Samina Ahmed, who just published a study on the threat posed by the madrasa system.
What it is doing is imparting a biased view of the world to these children, and they could be dangerous, because that's all they know.
Back in June, Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf announced new regulations to try and control the country's madrasas. They would be monitored and have to register with the government, and any schools where extremism and sectarian hatred were taught would face sanctions up to and including the jailing of their leaders for as much as 3 years.
That threat has had no impact yet, and the U.S. will try another strategy, a $100 million pledge to help Pakistan introduce computer, science, and world history courses into this closed, insular world. It'll be too late to win the hearts and minds of these older students, but what about Rahimullah and his peers?
How many of you think that America, the U.S., is a friend?
friend.
They have not yet been drawn into lockstep beliefs and goals. Rahimullah himself says he wants to be a doctor. But with the influences of Islamic militancy all around them, if they are to be reached, it will have to happen soon. Mike Taibbi, NBC News, Lahore.
There's other news to report tonight, including the death of one of the greatest quarterbacks in football history, Johnny Unitas, Johnny U, the Hall of Famer who broke almost every passing record in the NFL and won 3 championships, including Super Bowl V in 1971, all with the Baltimore Colts. Unitas retired in 1973. A spokesman for the now Baltimore Ravens said he died today of a heart attack. Johnny U was 69 years old. And as hard as it is to believe, another Florida election may end in a lawsuit. The state's new voting system put in place for yesterday's primary was a disaster. Some touchscreen voting machines didn't work, and some polling places had workers who didn't know how to operate them. As a result, no one knows for sure who won the Democratic primary for governor. Former Attorney General Janet Reno, who was trailing opponent Bill McBride in the count as of tonight, may challenge the election if she is on the losing end of what is a very close vote. The worst problems were in cities across Reno's South Florida power base, Miami-Dade, and Broward counties. At the New York Stock Exchange, just blocks from ground zero, the market open was delayed until noon out of respect for the morning events. Former Mayor Rudy Giuliani, Mayor Michael Bloomberg, and New York Governor George Pataki shared a moment of silence before the opening bell. Stocks couldn't hold on to some early gains. The Dow finished down more than 21 points. NASDAQ was down almost 5 points on the day. A much sadder statistic now, an estimated 3,000 people, 3,000 lost a parent last September 11th. Children. What does the future hold for them? NBC's Dawn Fratangelo has gotten to know one family in this uncharted territory.
Dad. My dad was a nice guy. He would do stuff for me, including coaching sports that I play, and he taught me all of the rules of almost every sport. To me, he was the best dad ever.
His dad, 35-year-old Tim Soulis, one of 6 children. So when he married his high school sweetheart, Katie, they made a pact to fill their house with the same number.
He wanted them to be buddies the way he had that buddy system with his family.
By last summer, Tim Soulis got his wish. Katie was pregnant with number 6.
How do you feel about the last day of summer?
I want to stretch into one more.
One more summer or one more day?
One more day.
That was Labor Day. On September 11th, Tim Soulis was working on the 105th floor of Tower 1. Last March in New Jersey, we first met the Soulises. Nicole, Timmy, Andrew, Chris, and Matthew were attending group sessions called Kids Can Survive with other children who lost a parent on 9/11.
Today, my mom had her baby shower, and my dad used to always throw that.
Surprisingly, little is known about how children cope with loss. So for 7 months, we followed the Soulises through the sessions.
I miss my dad so much.
And at home.
How would you describe it?
I'd say a roller coaster because we just go up like we're getting better, and then all of a sudden it just drops.
Last spring, that was the prevailing mood. So too was anger.
My mom sold this house, and I am not satisfied.
From the older boys, an added sense of responsibility.
That makes my heart bleed because they're not mature enough to know finances or the big things that adults do, and they want to be a part of that.
And from the youngest, Nicole, perhaps bewilderment when seeing her father on video for the first time in months. The first step for Mom, restore routine. School took a back seat. The kids instead needed to work through emotions.
They're still too young to realize that the emptiness isn't going to be filled by a Pokemon game or going on a field trip. It's going to be time before that really takes place.
Over the past year, they have struggled through a series of firsts. Easter weekend, another Soulis came into the world.
What are the guesses? Girl, it's Daniel, it's a boy.
I realized at that point this baby is never going to be held by his daddy. And I have to do this alone.
What is it? Birthdays have been the hardest. In August, on what would have been Tim's 36th, each child received a gift.
This is the very first present Daddy gave me when we were in high school.
New rituals in a family 6 months ago consumed by pain.
Where do you think you are in that process right now?
Like in a scale of 1 to 10, I'd say about 5.5.
Today, Andrew says he's more like a 7.5.
What should people know about you because of what happened to your dad?
I want them to know me as a regular kid. They might think that it's hard, but it's not as hard as they think.
Make no mistake, it has been terrifically hard. But experts say it is possible these children are doing as well as they seem.
Their anger is less, their happiness is more, and they're having fun. It's a process of getting through. It's not over or under. It is continuous.
One family somehow carrying on, with Mom now having to be both counselor and coach.
Squeeze it out.
Yet still guided by the head of the team, Dad.
I think he's telling me what to do every day. He's proud we're marching on. He would want us to go out and do everything we did when he was here. And do it in his name, do it in his honor.
Birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Daddy. Happy birthday to you. Okay, bye-bye. Let him go.
Dawn Fratangelo, NBC News, New Jersey.
For more information on coping with the aftermath of the terrorist attacks and how you can still make a difference, you can log on to our website at msnbc.com. I'll be back with more in a moment. Earlier today, a couple came up to me to share all they had left of a loved one lost at the World Trade Center. A fragment of his driver's license and his membership card for a moose lodge. But they were grateful for that small, incomplete reminder of his life. At the New York Historical Society, there's an exhibition of the personal and other effects recovered at the Trade Center site. The everyday items that help define who we are take on such poignancy when we see them in this context. The odds and ends of life become powerful reminders of what we lost 1 year ago. In the New York Times today, 7 pages of the victims from the 3 attack sites. In too many cases, the pictures were all the families were left. The parents of a naval officer killed at the Pentagon were carrying his wristwatch today, a fitting symbol of that awful moment a year ago when their time changed forever. 9/11, 1 year later. We have come so far, and yet we have so far to go. That's Nightly News for Wednesday, September 11th. I'll be back here shortly with a special Dateline NBC report, my conversation with the air traffic controllers who saw September 11th unfold before their eyes, and later, the president's speech to the nation from Ellis Island. Directly following that, the Concert for America. All that tonight here on this NBC station. I'm Tom Brokaw in New York.